It started as one of those days that seem designed to crush you. The kind of day where every plate feels heavier, every customer more demanding, and every smile more forced. I was in the middle of a double shift at the diner, sweat trickling down my back as I juggled trays, refilled coffees, and tried not to scream at the ancient cash register that jammed every time I touched it. The air inside was thick with the smell of bacon grease and frustration. I was rushing toward a booth when I heard the words that stopped me cold. "Your card's been declined," the cashier said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned my head just in time to catch the scene unfolding. A man, mid-40s, wearing a jacket, so worn it might as well have been his second skin, was fumbling with his wallet. His face turned beet red as he glanced nervously toward the booth where a woman and a little girl sat, their heads down, pretending not to notice. "Could you try it again?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The cashier sighed but swiped the card once more. The same response flashed on the screen: declined. I could see the man's hands trembling as he reached for another card. He didn't have to say it. I knew the truth just by looking at him. He didn't have the money. My heart squeezed painfully in my chest, a memory flashing in my mind of my own lowest moment when I'd stood in a grocery store, praying the cashier wouldn't notice my debit card was taped together because I couldn't afford a new one. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "Don't worry about it," I said, my voice firm and clear. "I'll cover it." The man's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with surprise. No, you don't have to do that," he stammered. "I'll figure it out." "It's fine," I said with a smile I hoped was reassuring. "Really?" The cashier hesitated, looking between us. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said, pulling out my own card. "Just add it to my tab." The man's shoulders slumped with relief, and for the first time, I noticed how much weight he seemed to carry, like the world had been pressing down on him for years. The woman at the booth gave me a soft smile, her eyes glassy as she mouthed, "Thank you." The little girl, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days, ran up to me and hugged my legs. "Thank you, lady," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the clatter of the diner. My throat tightened. "It's no big deal," I said, patting her head. "Just make sure you eat up, okay?" As they left, the man turned back one last time. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, "but I won't forget this." I didn't think much about it after they left. It was just a small act of kindness, one I'd hoped someone would do for me if the tables were turned. My shift dragged on, and by the time I got home to my cramped apartment, I was too exhausted to think about anything except collapsing onto my couch. But the next morning, as I was wiping down tables, I noticed a man standing at the entrance of the diner. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it cost more than my car. His presence was magnetic, and for a second, I wondered if he'd wandered into the wrong place. Then he locked eyes with me. "You're the one I'm looking for," he said, striding toward me. I blinked, confused. "Oh, excuse me?" "You helped my family," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "Yesterday. You paid for their meal." It took me a moment to connect the dots. This man was related to the struggling family I'd helped the day before. But something about his polished appearance didn't fit with their situation. "I'm Alexander Hunt," he said, extending a hand, "CEO of Hunt Enterprises." I stared at him, dumbfounded. The name sounded vaguely familiar, something I'd seen on a billboard or a headline in passing, but I couldn't fathom why someone like him would care about a random act of kindness in a small-town diner. "My brother and his family were the ones you helped," Alexander continued. "They called me last night and told me what you did. They were overwhelmed by your generosity." "It was just a meal," I said, still trying to process what was happening. "To you, maybe," he replied, his tone serious. "But to them, it meant everything." Alexander wasn't just there to thank me. He had a proposition. "I run a foundation," he explained. "It's designed to uplift people who embody selflessness and compassion. You've proven you're exactly the kind of person we want to support." I blinked. "Support? What does that mean?" "It means I'd like to give you an opportunity," he said, "to chase your dreams, to change your life." It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. "I don't understand," I said. "Why me?" "Because you acted without expecting anything in return," he said simply. "And that's rare." The offer sounded too good to be true. People didn't just show up and hand out life-changing opportunities to strangers. For the next few days, I wrestled with doubt. What if this was a scam? What if I wasn't good enough to make the most of it? But deep down, I knew I couldn't let fear hold me back. If there was even a chance this was real, I had to take it. The following week, I found myself sitting in a sleek office building that seemed more like the set of a futuristic movie than a place where decisions about people's lives were made. Alexander had invited me to his headquarters, promising to walk me through the opportunities his foundation could offer. Despite the nerves roiling in my stomach, I showed up, partly because I had nothing to lose and partly because something about his sincerity felt genuine. He greeted me personally, shaking my hand firmly. "I'm glad you decided to come," he said, leading me through glass-paneled corridors to a conference room. Inside, a team of professionals sat waiting with folders and laptops. They smiled warmly, but I still felt out of place in my second-hand dress and scuffed shoes. "We've reviewed your story," Alexander began as we all sat down. "You've worked hard your entire life, supporting yourself, helping others, and making sacrifices. This isn't just about rewarding your kindness. It's about giving you the tools to create the life you deserve." They laid out several options: funding to pursue higher education, resources to start a business, or even direct support to cover my immediate financial struggles. It was overwhelming. Each opportunity came with its own challenges and risks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't ready for any of it. "What would you choose if you were in my shoes?" I asked Alexander after the meeting ended. He smiled thoughtfully. "That depends. What's the one thing you've always dreamed of, but never thought was possible?" The question lingered in my mind long after I left the building. For as long as I could remember, I dreamed of opening a community center, a safe space for struggling families to find resources, support, and hope. I'd spent years volunteering at shelters and food banks, wishing I could do more. But dreams like that felt unattainable for someone like me, who could barely make ends meet. Still, as I sat alone in my apartment that night, I couldn't ignore the pull of that dream. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance. When I told Alexander about my idea, his eyes lit up. "That's exactly the kind of project we want to support," he said. His team quickly got to work, helping me create a detailed plan for the community center. They walked me through everything from securing a location to navigating permits and budgets. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. But with hope came fear. The fear of failure, of letting down the people who were counting on me, of proving to myself that I wasn't cut out for something this big. As word spread about the community center, people began reaching out to help. Some were old friends who had drifted away. Others were strangers inspired by my story. Even my co-workers at the diner pitched in, organizing a fundraiser to support the project. One volunteer, an elderly woman named Martha, became a regular fixture at the planning meetings. She'd run a similar center in her younger years and was full of practical advice. "You've got the heart for this," she told me one evening. And that's half the battle. Just when it seemed like everything was falling into place, disaster struck. The building I'd secured for the center, a modest but functional space on the edge of town, was suddenly pulled off the market. The landlord had received a better offer and didn't hesitate to take it. I was devastated. Without a location, the entire project was at risk. But Alexander refused to let me give up. "We'll find another place," he said confidently. "This is just a bump in the road." As we searched for a new location, I began to notice something strange. Anonymous emails started arriving in my inbox, warning me to stay in my lane and leave things to the professionals. At first, I dismissed them as spam, but then the threats became more personal. Someone clearly didn't want the center to succeed. When I mentioned the emails to Alexander, he frowned. "This isn't unusual," he said. "Projects like this can ruffle feathers, but we won't let them scare us." After weeks of searching, we finally found a new location, a former warehouse with plenty of space and potential. The price was steep, but Alexander's foundation covered the difference. Renovations began immediately, and watching the building transform into something beautiful was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Every day, more volunteers showed up, eager to lend a hand. The sense of community was overwhelming, and for the first time, I began to believe we could pull this off. As the grand opening approached, everything seemed to be falling into place. Families began signing up for the center's programs, local businesses offered sponsorships, and the media took an interest in our story. I should have been elated, but a nagging sense of unease lingered. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd become more frequent and more specific. One message read, "You don't know who you're messing with." 2 days before the grand opening, disaster struck. I arrived at the center to find the front door shattered and graffiti scrawled across the walls. The words were vile, aimed directly at me and the project. My heart sank as I surveyed the damage. The volunteers tried to reassure me, but the fear was impossible to ignore. If someone was willing to go this far, what else might they do? Alexander's response was immediate. "We're not backing down," he said firmly. He hired security for the center and contacted the police, ensuring the incident was thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, the community rallied around us, showing up in droves to clean up the mess and repair the damage. Their support was a reminder of why I'd started this journey in the first place. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for all of us. The morning after the attack, I walked into the community center to find a crowd of people waiting. Volunteers, families, even people I'd never seen before. All of them were there with tools, paint, and determination etched into their faces. "You're not doing this alone," Martha said, her voice steady despite her age. "This place means something to all of us." The sight brought tears to my eyes. Within hours, the graffiti was painted over, the shattered glass swept away, and the doors repaired. But more than that, the center was filled with life. Children laughing as they helped decorate, parents pitching in with ideas for future programs, and teenagers offering to create murals to make the space feel welcoming. As the day went on, my anxiety began to ease. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was ours. And together, we were unstoppable. The day of the grand opening arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Balloons and banners adorned the entrance, and the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafted through the air. A local news crew had come to cover the event, and the sight of their cameras made my heart race. Alexander stood beside me as I cut the ribbon, his presence as steadying as always. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and as people poured into the building, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Every room was alive with activity. Children playing in the rec area, parents attending workshops, and volunteers guiding families through the resources we offered. But even in the midst of the celebration, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I scanned the crowd, my eyes lingering on unfamiliar faces. Was one of them the person who'd tried to sabotage us? As the event wound down, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. But then I noticed him, a man standing by a black car, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He wasn't looking at the center, he was looking at me. My stomach tightened. I didn't recognize him, but something about his presence felt wrong. Before I could decide whether to confront him, he turned and got into the car, driving away without a word. The unease lingered long after he was gone. The next week, Alexander called me into his office. He looked unusually serious, his brow furrowed as he gestured for me to sit. "We've uncovered something," he said, sliding a file across the desk. "The threats, the vandalism, they're not random. They're coming from someone with a lot to lose." I opened the file and stared at the name on the first page, Richard Stanton. My breath caught. Stanton was a prominent businessman in the area, known for his real estate empire and deep ties to local politics. "Stanton owns a number of properties in this neighborhood," Alexander explained. "He's been exploiting families here for years, charging exorbitant rents and using intimidation to keep them quiet. Your center threatens his operation." I felt a surge of anger. "So, he's the one behind all of this?" Alexander nodded. "We have enough evidence to make that case. But confronting someone like Stanton won't be easy." Confronting Stanton meant stepping into dangerous territory. He was powerful, well-connected, and utterly ruthless. But I couldn't let fear stop me. If I backed down now, everything we'd built would be for nothing. With Alexander's help, I began gathering more evidence. We spoke to families who had been victimized by Stanton, documenting their stories and compiling proof of his unethical practices. Some were hesitant to come forward, afraid of retaliation, but others were eager to stand up against him. The deeper we dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Stanton wasn't just exploiting families. He was using illegal tactics to force people out of their homes, clearing the way for lucrative redevelopment projects. And he would stop at nothing to protect his empire. One night, as I was leaving the center, I noticed a car idling at the far end of the parking lot. I'd been cautious ever since the threats began, but this felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached my car, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. Before I could reach the driver's side, two men stepped out of the shadows. They didn't say anything, didn't have to. The look in their eyes said it all. My heart pounded as they advanced, their intentions clear. But just as they closed in, headlights flooded the lot. A black SUV screeched to a halt, and Alexander stepped out, his expression ice cold. "Walk away," he commanded, his voice sharp as steel. The men hesitated, clearly weighing their options. After a tense moment, they backed off, disappearing into the night. The attack was a wake-up call. Stanton wasn't playing games, and neither could I. With Alexander's support, we filed a formal complaint with the authorities, backed by the evidence we'd gathered. But Stanton wasn't about to roll over without a fight. The next day, I received a letter delivered to my home, not the center. Inside was a single message, written in bold, red letters. "Back off, or you'll regret it." I showed the letter to Alexander, my hands trembling. "What if he comes after me again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He won't," Alexander said firmly. "We'll protect you. But you have to decide, are you willing to see this through?" I thought of the families who relied on the center, the lives we were changing, and the future we were building. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. "Yes," I said. "I'm not backing down." The day of reckoning came faster than I anticipated. With Alexander's legal team working tirelessly, we filed a lawsuit against Stanton and his company, citing fraud, illegal evictions, and harassment. The case drew public attention, especially after several families stepped forward to share their stories. Stanton, unsurprisingly, hit back hard. His team of high-priced lawyers flooded us with counterclaims, attempting to discredit me and the community center. The media latched onto the drama, and my face was suddenly plastered across local news outlets. Headlines ranged from "Brave community leader takes on corrupt businessman" to "Is she in over her head?" The pressure was suffocating. Reporters camped outside the center, waiting for any scraps of drama. Volunteers grew nervous, unsure if they wanted to be part of a fight that felt increasingly dangerous. Even some of the families we'd helped hesitated to associate with us, afraid of retaliation. Through it all, Alexander stood by my side, his unwavering confidence the anchor I needed. "They're scared," he told me one evening as we reviewed the latest legal developments. "That's why they're coming at you so hard. You're exposing them for what they are." Just when I thought I'd weathered the worst, I discovered that one of our own had been feeding information to Stanton. A volunteer I'd trusted, someone who had been with us since the early days, was caught leaking documents and internal plans. The betrayal cut deep, leaving me questioning my judgment. "I did it for the money," the volunteer confessed when confronted. "You don't understand," he promised it would only be small things. Nothing that would hurt anyone. Alexander handled the fallout, ensuring the damage was contained. But the incident left me shaken. If someone so close could turn on us, who else could I trust? The closer we got to uncovering the full extent of Stanton's corruption, the more desperate he became. His tactics escalated from veiled threats to outright sabotage. One morning, I arrived at the center to find the power cut and a dead rat left on the doorstep, a grim warning that sent chills down my spine. The police investigation into Stanton's activities moved at a snail's pace, hampered by his connections and influence. Frustrated but determined, Alexander and I decided to take a different approach. If the system wouldn't hold Stanton accountable, we'd turn to the court of public opinion. With the help of Alexander's PR team, we organized a press conference to reveal everything we'd uncovered. Families who had been victimized by Stanton shared their stories, their voices raw with emotion. Photos and documents were displayed, painting a damning picture of Stanton's exploitation. The event was broadcast live, and the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage, and public pressure mounted for authorities to act. Within days, Stanton's name became synonymous with greed and corruption, and even his most loyal allies began distancing themselves. But Stanton wasn't done yet. His final move was as bold as it was reckless. Late one night, as I was leaving the center, Stanton himself showed up. He didn't bother with pretense or charm. He was a man cornered, his polished veneer shattered. "You think you've won," he sneered, stepping out of the shadows. "But you don't know who you're dealing with." I stood my ground, my heart pounding. "You're right. I didn't. But now, everyone does." His face twisted with rage. For a moment, I thought he might actually lash out, but the sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. Alexander and two security guards appeared, their presence a silent warning. Stanton glared at me one last time before turning to leave. "This isn't over," he muttered. But it was. The next morning, the police finally acted, arresting Stanton on charges of fraud, intimidation, and obstruction of justice. His empire crumbled, and the families he'd exploited finally began to see justice. With Stanton out of the picture, the community center flourished. Families felt safe again, and the programs we offered expanded to include job training, mental health support, and childcare. The scars of the battle remained, but they were a reminder of what we'd overcome. Alexander's foundation continued to support the center, and our friendship deepened into something that felt like family. He became not just a mentor, but a constant source of encouragement, reminding me that even in the darkest times, kindness and resilience could prevail. Looking back, I often thought about that moment in the diner when I decided to pay for a stranger's meal. It had seemed so small at the time, just a fleeting act of compassion, but it had set off a chain of events that changed my life and the lives of so many others in ways I could never have imagined. The community center wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, of refusing to let fear and greed win. And it all started with a simple choice to help someone in need.